All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the films of Celine Sciamma. If you're not familiar with who she is a French director. Or as I joked earlier, it is Pride Month, so what better way to celebrate Pride Month than with moody movies by French lesbians? I mean, I don't know about you, but that definitely gets me in the pride feeling. But in all seriousness, one of the reasons she is a pretty groundbreaking filmmaker. It doesn't really have as much to do with her sexuality, as much as it does with how the story she tells and how she approaches it, mainly in terms of how she frames these stories, stories of women and particularly love stories around women, um, in a way that subverts the way they've been told throughout a lot of not just cinema history, but in a lot of media, which we will get to. So, if you are not familiar with who Celine Sciamma is, she is a director based in France. All of her films are in French. But unlike some other people, all five of her films are available within the United States. You can find them streaming, you can pirate them. The Gmilk's library system has 4 out of 5 of her films, and I know that we at the very least have Portrait of a Lady on Fire here. Also, if you are familiar with, there is this store, there is an online store called Girls on Tops, and it is all about just putting the names of women directors on shirts. I had sent this link to my friend Ellie, and I said, I'm surprised you don't own this shirt already. Her response to it was just, "I want all of them," which I agree. I kinda wish they came in more colors because I don't like wearing white. I feel like I'm always gonna drop something on it. But they are great shirts. So Celine is someone who has her name on a shirt now. But she's also been, in addition to being a writer and director, very vocal about how women are portrayed in film and very vocal about the need to have women in the film industry in France. She's been very critical of the French industry, and just about sexism in the French industry, which, for as much as I think some Americans think of French and other European countries as being a lot more forward thinking, there is still a big issue of sexism in France. Actually, if you've been following, was a very big trial in France earlier this year about a woman who was abused by her husband, about basically abuse and rape culture being alive and well in France as well, and that trial being almost a reckoning with the culture. So she is someone who speaks out a lot about that. But you might know her mostly. Her most famous film in the United States is Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and we're going to talk about that and her other films. But first, we're going to talk about kind of who she was growing up. Similar to some other directors I've talked about, like, she wasn't the, like, "Oh my gosh, I was in love with film from a very early age." She was actually more of a bookish kid and didn't really get interested in film, beyond just as entertainment until she was a teenager. But she did have a grandmother who had her watch a lot of, Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, stuff like Singing in the Rain, the old Hollywood style classics. That was her encounter with a lot of film when she was younger. She's like, of course I had French movies. For her, they were just movies. But for her, what really excited her was the Hollywood classics that her grandmother would show her. Um, we'll talk about this more when we get to Petite Maman, but she actually considers part of Petite Maman to be a tribute to her grandmother as well. But when she was a teen, she started to get more interested in cinema, like as an art form. So there was a little art house theater called Utopia, and she's like, I'd go see 3 movies a week there. What I kind of found interesting about this personally is this is sort of kind of how I discovered film as well. I liked watching movies when I was a kid, but I didn't start to really appreciate movies as an art form and as a way to really get a message out there until I was a teenager. So it was kind of cool to read interviews with her and go, hey, this sort of is in line with how I discovered cinema. Um, And she's also like one of the younger filmmakers that I've discussed. Kind of like sort of like Jordan Peele and Bong Joon-ho, born in like the 1970s. So you have she's someone who, in America, if you're born in the 60s and 70s, you're kind of raised on like the new Hollywood cinema. You had a lot of the 80s stuff. Oddly enough, so was she. She talks about that as well. And I'll bring that up when we talk about water lilies. So a lot of her inspiration for films, she's named Studio Ghibli, particularly when she talks about Petite Maman, old Hollywood films that her grandmother showed her. So she also talks about teen movies from the 80s and 90s, stuff like Fast Times at Ridgemont High or TV shows like Saved by the Bell. And she's like, oh yeah, there's directors like David Lynch, Patricia Mazzuri. But she has and she had an Italian interview where the interviewer asks, "You once said, quote, I spent my whole life loving films that sometimes hated me back, identifying with Superman, for example. Who are the male and female filmmakers who contributed to your growth and with whom you feel an affinity with in your career and is the woman you are today?" So her answer is, there are two ways to answer that question. There's the chronological truth, which regards the directors whom we meet in our formative years as cinephiles and who change us, which I can kind of relate to. Like a lot of the filmmakers I saw when I was a formative, getting into film as a teenager were men. So back to her question. And there's Nomi Levowski, the first woman filmmaker I identified with. There's David Lynch, who I feel explored the theme of what being a woman means, and I was very taken with that. Plus the French director Patricia Mazzuri, and yet it's more interesting for me to comment on the present. That is everything I've learned about the history and the culture of women filmmakers whom I've never heard of in the early days, and which allows me to make connections to the works I discover today. This is why I'd rather reference the work of filmmakers whose films I hadn't seen yet, such as Alice Guy, Mabel Normand, Chantal Ackerman, Yannick Bellon, Germaine Dulac, and Marie Epstein. I find that more interesting than telling you whether or not to what degree Steven Spielberg was important to me. There are things that may not have been passed to us yet that we have somehow acquired one way or another. So her way of talking about that, it's she may not have seen works by some of these women, but via like cultural osmosis or learning, and just their general influence, they still inspire her. So some of them, like if you're not familiar with Chantal Ackerman, she directed Jean Dillman, which is a very well-known movie, or Alice Guy Blanche, who is I should say, the first known woman filmmaker. But she made like 2 3-minute short movies back in the late 1800s. But I think that's a really interesting question because for a lot of women who are into film, um, be they just consumers or directors or writers, cinema is still fairly, um or has been, at least the canon, fairly male centric, even though there have always been women making films, there's always been women making art, but in terms of who's talked about as like these are the people you need to see, it's mainly male, 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 not a lot of women. Or I mean, I remember taking film classes in college. The first woman director we talked about was Leni Riefenstahl, which, if you don't know who she is, she was a Nazi collaborator who made propaganda films for Hitler. Um, so I kind of like how she answered that idea, and almost this idea of like it's something that hated me back. That idea of like a lot of male filmmakers didn't really see women as characters worth really exploring. I just really liked that answer, and that also kind of ties into a lot of the themes that she tackles. So, um, if we're talking about her academics, when she went into college, she initially got her degree in French literature. She did not see herself as going to be a director of films. She figured like that's a man's world. It's too masculine. I'm not going to be accepted again, even though France has given us women like Agnes Varda. It's given us Chantal Ackerman. Again, Alice Guy Blanche, so it's not as if there weren't women directors in France, but she just kind of saw it as like who gets more opportunities. who's more revered. She just kind of felt like it's a man's world. But she did go to film school, but she went going, I'll be a screenwriter, I'll be a critic. So she went to La Famille, which is very prestigious school. And so the draft for her first feature, Water Lilies, was a part of her final exam. And so she received her degree in screenwriting, and that was it. Like, she just wrote her screenplay. She did not think she was going to direct it. It was her one of her one of her instructors, who was a famous director himself. He's the one who suggested you should direct this. And just Xavier Bavoy, he if you don't know who he is, he's directed The Guardians of Gods and Men. And so it was very affirming for her to hear a male filmmaker, again, she considers the world of directing to be very male dominated, say, this, not only this script is great, but you should be the one to direct it. Um, so what are the common themes of her work? So kind of going back a slides ago when I talked about her influences, and if you can kind of tell with where we're going about this, a lot of her themes cover being a woman and what it is like to be a woman in this current world, both in this current world and in the case of Portrait of a Lady on Fire in the past. So one of the things I love, this is from an interview she did. It was with a publication called Lesbian News. I mean, of course, they would cover like, oh, French lesbian picture. Yeah, we'll talk to you. But I loved this one line where she said, cinema has been talking about women for a century now, but mostly men have, obviously been talking about it. Again, this idea of, men have made so many movies about women, but women's voices has still been grossly underrepresented in film. And that is not to say, and again, I will say this as a woman, that is not to say a man cannot make good movies about women. I think that's absolutely true. Off the top of my head, Terms of Endearment, I think it's great. Just to give one example. So again, I don't want to come across as saying like, well, only women can make movies about women, only women can write books about women. I think that is a little small-minded. And I mean, I've talked about this with Scorsese. Scorsese doesn't, women aren't in his movies as much, but when there are women in his films, they are very good characters and they always have agency. So that's another example. But being a woman, or at the very least, like, the female gender is something that she explores a lot in her films. And that also goes into one of her other big movies, which is gender and sexual fluidity. So a lot of her movie, again, her being lesbian, that comes up in a lot of her films. And in some cases, there the freedom of finding your sexuality, but also what you might have to close off from the world, what it's like to find that. And, is there fear, are you fearful of that coming out? Are you allowed to come out? And there's also, in terms of gender, being a woman, you know, how do you conduct yourself in the world? And also, if you're not a woman, what freedoms do you kind of have that you may not have if you're a woman, which comes into play specifically with her film Tomboy. Um, we'll get into this a lot with specifically Portrait of a Lady on Fire and Girlhood, but she likes to take a more realistic look on like certain film tropes, i.e. coming of age stories. She likes to put a more realistic lens on these. So you don't have the very, polished look that you would have in other films. And she also likes to explore young people a lot. And a lot of this came from her being a younger person and kind of having like being young and having to figure herself out. So um so there's two quotes. She goes, when you're writing for kids, you can write the most experimental, radical fiction because they don't have the cultural background, they don't have any expectation of what cinema should be. It can be very emotional. That's a great thing for cinema. I think she was talking about specifically a movie she wrote called My Life is a Zucchini, but she was also talking about her film Petite Maman, which I would not say it's a children's film, but it is a film that anybody of any age could watch. And I love this other quote: teenagehood is the loneliest time in your life because you discover everything about yourself, your own secret. Adults can be around, even protective and caring. They can't change the fact that all of those discoveries are violent and lonely. And in a lot of her films, like adults are there. In some cases, they are helpful or as helpful as they can be at the time. The film Tomboy is a really good example of that, where both of her parents are present and they do care about the kid, but they also, at the end of the day, this is something the main character has to figure out. Or in the case of Girlhood, the parents are there somewhat, but they are also very busy and they can't be as present as they like to be. But I really liked that because, again, I think everyone has been a teenager at some point, and even if you have a very loving family and you have people around you, going through and figuring stuff out can still feel incredibly isolating. This is also a quote from her a Guardian article. She goes when she was talking about one main theme for her film. She goes, "In my films, it's always the same," she says. "It's always about a few days out of the world where we can meet each lover, and love each other. It's also about female characters because they can be themselves in a private place where they can share their loneliness, their dreams, their attitudes, and their ideas." So the first one we're going to discuss is her debut feature, Water Lilies. Again, as I'd mentioned, the first draft of this film was her final project for her, I guess what we considered her master's degree. And this was her debut in 2007, and you watch it and you're like, very mature, well assured debut for a filmmaker. And so this is about three girls. They're all on a synchronized swimming team, and they're all kind of, again, figuring themselves out. I know some people now would look at a movie like this and immediately be scandalized and go, "What are you doing to these kids?" But boy, do I hate to break this to you. Uh, I'm sorry, teens are thinking about sex all the time. And again, say this as a former teenager. Um, only I was not on synchronized swimming team. I was just alone on my parents' computer reading fan fiction. But it is a very, it's not a lascivious look at this. So I'll go into this more with Portrait of a Lady on Fire, but when we talk about female sexuality, especially female sexuality when they're teenagers, especially if they're starting to realize, ooh, I think I'm attracted more to girls than boys. Usually that is something done through the lens of, to put it very politely, a male fantasy, or as we'll get to later, the male gaze. Versus here, there's something almost, I don't want to say clinical, but definitely raw, and there's a part of it that almost feels embarrassing. That idea of like, oh God, I'm starting to have these feelings and I don't quite know what to do with them. And it gets into the messiness of that. And again, this movie does not have the nice, clean ending. You do get the sense that the main character's kind of figured herself out a little bit more, but there is no bow on the end of this story. And a lot of her films are like that. And I liked this quote where she talked about, she goes, "I wanted the film to be an answer to that undying tradition of fascination. Water Lilies goes to the locker room of girls not to fantasize, but to see the crude reality. The film is not voyeuristic. The sexual content is dramatic, not erotic." And what was interesting is there's a really long Guardian article where they interview her, and she talks about this. And she goes, "There's one scene I filmed in 2007. I wrote it as one character, her boyfriend is basically talking her into a sexual encounter." And she even said, she's just like, "Oh, I wouldn't have even 10 years later, I wouldn't have even filmed that because now we realize that's assault or at the very least coercion versus, oh, it's just an awkward encounter." And so she was even talking about how the attitudes have changed, in her opinion, for the better since she made this film. Another interesting thing to note about this, when she talked about this movie, she was saying a lot of the more American response was like, "Oh, this is so unlike a lot of American films about teen sexuality." And she's like, "Well, that's funny because I actually grew up watching stuff like Fast Times at Ridgemont High and sitcoms like Saved by the Bell and Parker Lewis Can't Lose," which kind of inspired her a bit. But again, she wanted to put more of a realistic look at it, but it's interesting how American culture inspired her to make this film. So now we're moving on to her follow-up feature, which is a film called Tomboy. Again, came out in 2011. 14 years later, it's interesting. So I think I saw this in like 2015 because I'd heard like, oh, this is a really cool movie. Like you should watch it. And I didn't really know who Celine was. I heard more of the story about it. It was very interesting watching this film now in 2025. So the movie's about a 10-year-old child named Lore. I'm just going to use they because the film's a little ambiguous with everything. They move to a new area with their family, with their father, their mother, and their younger sister. Um, their mother's also pregnant with the third child of the family. So this kid moves in. So they, present a little more boyish. So they already have short hair. They're very close with their dad. They also have a really loving relationship with their sister. And, they like the mom, but you get the sense that they relate a little bit more to the dad. But they're already a little bit more masculine presenting. So clearly, fitting the tomboy archetype. But when they move in, they see, a bunch of boys and, kids, mostly boys, playing soccer around the apartment complex. So Lore just decides when someone asks, like, oh, who are you? What's your name? They say their name is Mikhail and starts to pose as a boy. And what's interesting about this is it's not just you know, Lore never says, I want to be a boy. Lore never says, I am a man, as in an affirmative, this is who I am. I have figured out myself for the rest of my life. What's interesting is what attracts them to this is the freedom that the boys seem to have. The one other girl that's around them seems to be a little more hesitant, more like watching the boys while the boys are running around, roughhousing, playing soccer, playing silly games. Lore does see what the boys do, and it's like, oh, they seem to have a freedom that I may not have as a girl, because, again, as a girl, by the time you're 10, you've already heard you have to be ladylike, be a little more proper. Girls don't do that, So that's not something you see too much in Lore's home life, but just via society in general, you're probably already processing those cues that you're getting from society. The other thing I like about this film is Sciamma talked about specifically wanting this movie to be ambiguous about both the gender and the sexuality, because Mikhail does develop a crush on the other girl, Lisa. But Lisa does not find out Lore's a girl until the end of the film. So she talks about basically saying, like, I want this to be something everybody could see. So she goes, the movie's not about psychology. It's not about why she's doing this. It's about how. So everyone can relate. Very different people can come to me and say, oh, that was my childhood. And from an interview with Take One Cinema, she says, quote, it's not based on a true story. It's not my story. But when you're writing about childhood, you have to look back in your memories to get back to that feeling, how it felt. Not in a nostalgic way, but really in the present. The movie is really impressionistic about childhood, trying to get back those sensations and feelings. And I was kind of a tomboy. I was mistaken for a boy sometimes, and I remember that I really sometimes I liked it. I remember the freedom it gave me. So I had that story in mind of a little girl pretending to be a little boy. And I decided that would be my film because I thought there was a good balance. I'm always looking for the right balance of a cool subject with intimate insight, um, and also with strong storytelling. And again, I like how the film handles this. Again, it's the ambiguity can be very helpful. When the movie ends, I mean, it's brought up, it's, like, one point Lisa asks Mikhail, oh, I looked on the school roster. You're in my class, right? I didn't see your name. So you get the sense of, like, okay, the jig is going to be up pretty soon. And unfortunately, Laura Mikhail beats up another boy because the boy shoved their sister, and then it becomes like, the mother of the other kid says, "I'm looking for your son." Laura McKell's mother, "I don't have a son," and then she starts to realize, oh boy, okay. So unfortunately, um, some kids find out, Lisa and the other boy then find out, Mikhail is not exactly Mikhail, and then very sad scene where it's more traumatically exposed to the larger group. But when the film ends, um, Laura sees Lisa outside, goes and talks to her, and Lisa just asks, "What's your name?" And it ends kind of with the idea of, at the very least, they may have kind of figured something out. I mean, who knows? They're at the very least like, the other thing I like about this movie, I'll start again, is at the end of the film, a couple of weeks have passed. The mother has given birth at that point. You don't see Lore dressing more feminine. You don't see Lore growing the hair out. They're still short hair, very tomboyish. So at the very least, they're like, well, I like my expression at the very least. And you get the sense that they will be okay regardless of what they choose. They may have unlocked a piece of themselves or they may have started a journey. But it's actually, I think, a really sweet and sensitive film that everyone should see. So moving on to Girlhood. I would actually say of all five of her films, this is, I would say, the most intense and maybe the saddest, probably because the subject matter is very sad. So Sciamma initially wanted to do this film because, again, she's concerned not only about female representation in film, but she's also realizing like France is more diverse now than it was in the earlier ages of cinema. And she still's like, I still saw that opportunities for Black women and girls were not what they should be, considering, how many of them live in our country. So she did want to take it upon herself to provide those opportunities. Actually, this is another shout out to Tomboy. The kids who live in the apartment complex, it's a fairly diverse group. It's not commented upon. It's just, yeah, this is just what it's like living in France. So it's about a girl named Mariam, and she's a French African girl. So she lives with her family, but the one who really seems to control the house is her older brother, and he is not exactly the nicest person there. He's kind of power tripping, and it's kind of an oppressive environment for Mariam. It's not oppressive in the ways certain Western filmmakers like to portray immigrant neighborhoods, i.e., the extremely religious or very culturally conservative parents who don't think anything of like French culture is worth doing. It's her brother is, again, I think power tripping is the best way to put it. So she's not doing well at school. They're kind of talking about sending her to a vocational school. What I found interesting in this movie is it's like, is she really not doing well at school because she's not gifted academically, or is she not doing well at school because she is gifted, but she has struggles and they are not being addressed in this school, which been a lot of studies in the United States and kind of relates to other countries where children of color tend to be written off as just not smart when they might just have learning disabilities. I do wonder if that's something Sciamma kind of was hinting at. Um, but she finds a group of girls. She finds like a little girl gang, and this is where she actually finds a lot of her empowerment. So, from a Jezebel interview, she says, quote, "The group can help you get a voice and find out who you are. The friendship between women was something that I wanted to depict and to unfold. It's about empowerment and feeling stronger together, but it's also about tenderness and becoming a woman, but also portraying childhood. They can look like divas, and then a moment after the children are jumping on beds. I wanted to show this contrast. I wanted the movie to be built around friendship, but also convey that feeling and build empathy for the friendship others have for that character." And that also makes some events later in the film a little more heartbreaking. What's interesting in this movie is, I don't know if anyone remembers, like 4 or 5 years ago, there was a French film that Netflix acquired, called Mignons, or more known in the US as Cuties. So if you don't know what that movie was, You might remember it from Netflix's god-awful publicity for that film, where they basically took these girls in dance contest doing very provocative dances to promote the movie, which greatly misrepresented that film. That movie is also kind of similar to this. It's about a girl. She's French. She's from an African immigrant family. She's not really fitting in anywhere, and she finds a group of, other friends where she starts to go like, okay, cool, I fit in. That one's about girls who are starting to, watch music videos and kind of see highly sexualized stuff and mimic it, because they're like, oh, well, this is just fun to do. This is what we're supposed to do as girls, right? Um, Girlhood is a little different, but I remembered like thinking of when Cuties came out, I'm like, oh, I kind of get what that's trying to do. And I kind of wish that people could have viewed that without Netflix like completely botching any publicity and PR for it. Girlhood has a little bit higher stakes than Cuties. Cuties, the worst thing that happens to her is she makes a mistake with social media and her mother gets mad at her. But at the end, she kind of is like, okay, I'm gonna go be a kid. I think I need to put my phone, put the phone away and just go jump rope or something. Um, Mariam definitely is in dicier situations by the end of the film. But the thing I like about this movie is, and I would say with most of her films, be it Water Lily or Tomboy, is the characters are allowed to make mistakes, but it is not the end of the world. They don't become like classic cautionary tales where they made one wrong turn as a teenager and their lives are ruined forever. Um, Even though Girlhood ends there, it's on a bit of a somber note. You do get the sense that Miriam has at the very least figured some things out about herself and has a bit more confidence to not put up with people treating her poorly. She's able to tell off her brother. She's able to tell off a person who tries to take advantage of her. And then she meets another guy who says, well, if you marry, stay with me, we'll get married. She's like, well, I don't want that either. And you get the sense at the end where she's going to try to figure out where to go, but she at least has a little bit more confidence as to how to do that. Unfortunately, this is the one movie that is not available in Gmilks, but we could at the very least check on the state level. And I think you can always purchase it to rent. So now we are going to talk about, I don't mean this hyperbolically, one of the greatest movies of this century to be made. Um Again, I'm going to say this, all of Celine's films are great. I think this is her best one. This is her firing on all cylinders, and this is such a beautiful film as well. Also, this movie holds kind of a little piece in my special place in my heart because Todd, correct me if I'm wrong. I think this was the last movie we saw in 2020 before theaters shut down.
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, it was Red River had it, and we were going, I think we went like to an early afternoon show because even then there was starting to be like all the talk of COVID, and there was the there was that conference in Boston. Stuff was already starting to kind of close, so I'm like, whatever, let's go now. Let's space ourselves out. Um and I'm very glad I did because I didn't get to a theater for months after that. I'm like, well, I'm glad this was my final theatrical experience. I mean, my goodness, like a week or two later, I was like, are movie theaters going to exist anymore? Oh well, at least this is the last one. So, this is Celine's only period piece at this point. Um, or I should say, complete period piece. So it is about a painter named Marianne, played by Nomi Merlant. If you don't know who she is, she has been in a couple of English language features, mainly Tar with Kate Blanchett. So she's commissioned to paint a portrait of a young woman, Heloise, played by the other also amazing Adele Hanel, who was in Water Lilies as well. And they fall in love. So there are no men in this movie pretty much, and this is where like what's great about this film is you're kind of just seeing it's Marianne, it's Heloise, And then there's the servant girl who lives there as well. You're just basically seeing them act very freely because they are not under the eye of men. So they get to talk a little more freely, they get to, converse with each other in a way that they wouldn't if men were around, but at the same time, Heloise is being married off to a nobleman. Her sister has passed away, and it's hinted that her sister took her own life because she didn't want to be married off. Marianne is someone who, in order to get painting jobs, she has to use her father's name, and she can't paint men. Then the servant girl, we find out late in the film, is pregnant, and they try to help her terminate the pregnancy before going to see a midwife to help her medically do that. But you see all of these ways where even though men aren't around, these women are still affected by patriarchy and by a male-dominated society. But in this house by the sea where men aren't present, they are able to find freedom. So there is that, and what I love is like there's so much that's unspoken. None of this is like spelled out very obviously. It's just stuff that you pick up on. Also, I do love at the end of the movie when a man finally shows up, it is almost framed as a jump scare. Like, oh my God, what's a man doing here? But I don't know. I just remember watching that, going like, I don't know. They're just living on the French seaside. They're eating bread and cheese and just like drinking wine. This sounds great. I feel like this is just something I want for like, I don't know, a month out of the year. It also, again, I don't want to spoil too much. It has one of the most beautiful endings I have seen of any movie made this century. I will not spoil it. You should watch it. We have it here. You will know what I am talking about when you see it. Um, I'm trying not to cry just thinking about it. The other reason I think this is a very interesting film to look at is about 6 years prior, a film called another, film about a lesbian relationship came out called Blue is the Warmest Color. And while that film was very well received in places like Cannes, it also drew a lot of criticism. One, because the director was accused of having a, let's just say, a hostile work environment and did stuff that could be construed as harassment. The actresses even talked that it wasn't exactly the most pleasant experience filming it. But then there were also a lot of women who said, well, the sex in this film seems very for male enjoyment rather than to show their relationship. And again, it's very playing to the male gaze versus Portrait of a Lady on Fire is one that really tries to subvert it. We see a couple of moments where it's fade to black, or it's more the two of them in bed, but Marianne is just drawing a picture of Heloise, which, by the way, Nomia Milan, in one interview, she says, oh, we talked about a lot of romantic films. Titanic was one of them. So before we go on, you've heard me say the phrase the male gaze. So what is it? Um, it's coined by there was a film theorist named Laura Mulvey, and it refers to how women are portrayed in cinema. And it's usually this is as succinctly as I can put it, for the pleasure of and through the eyes of men. Um, this is something where I think the minute I say this, you will go, "Oh, I can think of about 5 examples off the top of my head." And I actually think a very famous example of this is from a beloved franchise, and that is Star Wars, particularly Leia's gold bikini from Return of the Jedi. Now, to be fair to Star Wars, Star Wars as a whole is inspired by pulpy serials of like the 1930s, and Leia's outfit as well is a nod to that. And I will also go, Leia has a lot more agency. She's definitely tougher. She gets to save herself. But you cannot deny that that bikini is, and even the way she's filmed in that is again very, you know, for the enjoyment of the men in the audience. So this is a quote from Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed with their periods coded for strong visual and erotic impact, so they can be said to connote to be looked atness. So you could think, let's say, Marilyn Monroe in The 7 Year Itch, again, Princess Leia in the gold bikini, uh, or even like some older films, we might not consider them that provocative now, but if you've seen Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the robot Maria is very male gazy. And again, that is intended because she's supposed to be a little more sexy and provocative. But then that also gets into another contrast of the Madonna and the whore thing. So you have either the very, you know, sexy woman who is bad, and then the very virtuous woman who is more modest and covered up. That's a conversation for another day. But again, this is something that goes even predates cinema. It's been talked about in art and paintings. And actually, to go back to Titanic, that is an interesting, a really good case. And I have a lot of critiques of James Cameron. But the scene of Kate Blanchett being drawn is one where I would actually say it resists the male gaze very well, because it is not about lasciviously looking at her. The point of that scene is actually the connection that Rose and Jack have with each other. Um, Full disclosure, I saw Titanic at 11, and I'm starting to really realize how much of an effect that had on like my view of romance. I've joked I'm a romantic in the classical sense, i.e., they mostly can end up together and one of them has to die, and I blame Titanic. But I also have often said I think the scene of Jack drawing Rose is one of the most romantic things I've ever seen. But that is one where even though Kate Winslet is nude, she's not really being seen through the male gaze. She's not there served up on a platter to be sexy. It's there to be connection between two people. And I would also like to say this again, this does not mean that just because a man is directing, that it is automatically in the male gaze. I think there are movies that have been directed by women that I think fall into the male gaze as well. I would actually give last year's Baby Girl as a good example of that. And there are men who have directed stories about women who have resisted it. A good example is South Korean filmmaker Park Chan-wook. When he directed The Handmaiden, another story of two women who fall in love with each other. When he directed the big scene where they finally consummate their love, he made sure that the only other person on set besides him and the actresses were his female assistants, to number one, make sure it was comfortable, everyone was comfortable, but also so they could give him critique and go like, does this look, is this too, again, male gazy? So again, just because a man's directing it doesn't mean it's automatically going to be male gaze. So how does this relate to Portrait of a Lady on Fire versus Blue is the Warmest Color? Well, a lot of it comes down to sex. And, again, sorry, this happens when we talk about movies made for adults. Sorry, Gen Z. So if you haven't seen Blue is the Warmest Color, or you don't remember the lead up to it, it's like a 3-hour film about it's mainly about a main character, Adele, and she falls in love with a woman named Emma and their relationship together. Actually, in French, it's called The Life of Adele, chapters 1 and 2. But the big selling point and the buzz, at the very least for American audience, was there's a 10-minute long sex scene between these two actresses. Oh my God, we have to go. So I saw this movie. I actually believe I saw this film with Ellie. And the movie is actually very good. I don't want to say it's a bad film. I think it's a really good portrayal of a first real relationship, and also how it falls apart. You have class differences in there. Adele is from a more working class background. Emma's from a more, upper class artistic background. Adele goes on to be a school teacher, and Emma, as they're like years into their relationship, is like, oh, why are you doing that? That's a job that's beneath you. And they start to kind of realize they don't have much in common anymore. So you have this story of the beginning and the end of a relationship, which is fairly realistic. And then in the middle of this film is a very jarring sex scene that seems like it is made for the consumption and pleasure of men. And there is a long history of lesbian sex scenes being in both regular mainstream cinema and in, let's just say, adult entertainment as being for the enjoyment of men rather than women, or even just as a way to show a story. It's automatically seen as more titillating and erotic rather than just, as Celine would say, dramatic. And I think is the warmest color is a good depiction of that. It's not dramatic. It's meant to be erotic. And not that erotic is fine, but it almost doesn't match the tone of the movie. And again, as I put there, both of the actresses, Lea Seydoux, you've probably seen, she's been in a couple of American films as well. They had some difficulty on set with the director. And again, I don't think that takes away from the movie being good, but that's also something I would say keep in mind while you're watching that. It's say, oh, is this exploitation happening? But now we're going to look at Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which Celine directed. And so the emotional core is really what's at the center of the movie. There's no 10-minute long sex scene to market this film on. So there is sex, there is nudity. This isn't always fade to black. But again, she focuses more on the two of them in bed together, the two of them having intimacy rather than explicit sex. And for her, she's just like, well, again, being a woman who has been with women, I kind of go off of that versus, showing anything extremely explicit because Sciamma also knows, again, relationships between women are often seen as titillation for men. So just the very fact that she treated this as more of an emotional love story rather than a physical love story is something that kind of subverts the male gaze. And another good thing, just to contrast her with not just the director Blue is the Warmest Color, but a lot of male director, or I should just say directors in general. She made sure she was very communicative with both of the performers to make sure no one felt exploited. It's kind of on my mind because it came out recently, but there was a film about Maria Schneider who was in Last Tango in Paris, and that really awful story of how she did not know that scene with Brando was going to happen. Again, the importance of communication between actors is paramount, I think, no matter who is directing the film. But yes, if you've not seen Portrait of a Lady on Fire, I would absolutely do it. It is one of the best love stories of the century. So now we're moving on to probably um, very polar opposite film, Petite Maman. So again, from a again, I don't want to say it's a doomed love story between two women because you do get the sense that the love is still there at the end, but now we're going on to meeting your parent, meeting your mom as a kid. So this is one of Ellie's favorite films. So this is about an 8-year-old girl. Her grandmother had just passed away, and her mother, and her father are going to the house to clean everything up. They're probably going to sell it. So when she goes into the woods, her mom is very distant, and of course, the girl, she understands her mom is distant. She understands her mom is sad. However, when you're 8 years old, you don't truly recognize the real weight of everything that's happening. All she knows is her mom is not really there. And then one day her mom is just gone completely. And so she's like, okay, what's wrong? My mom is sad and now she's gone. So she goes into the woods and then she meets another girl her age who has the name of her mom, Marion. And credit to this movie, it doesn't beat around the bush. The girl just says, I think I'm your daughter. But then it's very sweet because they get to just play with each other. They have slumber parties, they build a fort together. She goes to see her grandmother when her grandmother was younger, and they get to have dinner together and make pancakes. It is this really beautiful idea of, I mean, there's tale as old as time in terms of seeing your parents as a person and not the more idealized. When you're very young, you see mom and dad as their mom and dad. They're authority figures. You don't realize the whole life that they had had before you. You get hints of it because, well, there's grandma and grandpa, maybe there's aunts or uncles or something, but you don't quite really realize it. So this is a different take on it. It's seeing your parent as a person, but also through the eyes of a child. And I loved this quote that she had. We meet our mothers politically when we grow up. We understand the decisions they made and the specific pressures they were under. The political system, the reproductive system. At some point, we read the world the same as they did. But through fiction, through time travel, we can do it from a place of equality. So she talked about the idea of like meeting eye to eye. And so this is also from the same Guardian piece where she goes the author says, specifically where Petite Maman goes is deep into the relationship between an unreliable mother and her bruised, anxious child. Its magical realist conceit serves to erase the years and place its two protagonists eye to eye. The tragedy of families, Siam explains, is that we are only in sync with our parents when reach the age that they were. And by that point, of course, they have already moved on. So and that's where she gets into we meet our mothers politically. So again, we all get to that point where we become adults and then realized, oh, our parents had whole lives before us and they are just the same as us, fallible humans who make mistakes. So again, this idea of rather than waiting until you're an adult to find that out, her daughter goes and sees like, oh, this is, my mom loved my grandma. This is what my grandmother was like. And maybe this is why my mom is a little more sad. And this has a I would say this has a happy ending. Um, just the idea of the girl and her mom are going to be okay. Her whole family is going to be okay. But this is the one I would say even more than Portrait of a Lady on Fire, I would say have some tissues. Definitely a little bit of a tearjerker. Um, Another, I guess, a sadder piece about it was, Siama had wondered, like, what would it be like if my mom and I had met as children? Like, would we be friends with each other? Would we have the same father? Like, would our fathers be similar? Um, and the interviewer did ask her, so has your mom seen it? And she says, oh, yeah. She said she saw it. And the interviewer says, "So are you guys close?" And Sam eventually just says, "I'm not going to beat around the bush. We're not close." So she doesn't really elaborate more after that. But she did also talk very warmly about her grandmother on her father's side, in this case, who again introduced her to all these old Hollywood films and just how meaningful that connection was. And you get the sense that also this idea of getting to see your grandmother when she was a little bit younger and kind of seeing her in a different light as well. Again, there's a reason she said this film kind of resurrected her grandmother for her. So some other film work. She's only made 5 feature-length film, but she has directed some shorts. So La Première Communions, Caches Joy, Pauline, which was specifically directed as like a pride film. And for writing credits, actually, she wrote Les Baconettes with Namia Merlant. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering the French pronunciation of these. She also wrote a really good stop motion animated film called My Life as a Zucchini, or in French, Courgette. Courgette. Um, but a lot of these you're able to find online. We actually do have Life as Zucchini in our collection. So activism. I had mentioned at the top of the program that she's been vocal about more representation for women behind the camera, better roles in the front. But her most public display of start again. So she's part of the 50-50 by 2020 movement, was trying to get 50% of women, 50% of the film industry as women. And it's nice to see, if anyone remembers the Agnes Varda program, where there was Agnieszka, the Polish director Agnieszka Holland said that we talked about how Agnes Varda would open her doors to other women and make sure that other women could work on our films and get a foothold into the industry. And there are a lot of women who do that, and Sciamma is like that as well. She tries to make sure she has women working on her films, recommends them, basically instead of pulling the ladder up after her, leaving it in to make sure other people can join her. She was and speaking of Agnes Varda, she was in that march with Varda at Cannes at Tuam in 2018. But probably her most public recent show of activism came in 2022, um, when she, along with Adele Hanel, Nomi Merlant, and some other actresses, they walked out of the Caesar Awards ceremony. So if you don't know what the Caesars are, they're pretty much like the Oscars of French cinema. So, um, sorry. Actually, I think it may, no, I think it was 22. I'm now wondering if I got the date wrong. But anywho, Polanski was up for Best Director for I don't know what movie it was because I don't follow what movies he makes anymore. But I think if you're coming to my programs and you watch cinema, I think we all know what Roman Polanski did and why he's not allowed back in the United States anymore. Or if he, more accurately, if he came back to the United States, he'd be arrested. Anywho, but he has been allowed to live in France and make films freely. And also, I should note, there have been other accusations against Polanski since he left the United States. So when he won Best Director, Hanel, Sciamma, and Merlant walked out with Hanel being incredibly vocal, screaming, "Bravo, you awarded a pedophile." And again, we are in 2025. There has been this people hoping that this big trial is maybe a reckoning with rape culture and sexism in France on a larger scale. And also, it's worth noting Gerard Depardieu, a fairly well-known French actor, is also in the midst of, at the very least, accusations. I think there might be a trial coming up for him. And there is a hope that there is a Me Too movement for it in France that actually succeeds. So when she talked about it, she initially told the Guardian interview that there was no real plan, but they said, well, a public protest at the Caesars doesn't just happen. And she says, no, okay. But there was no plan. It's all about the moment in a matter of seconds. It's about moving your legs. Simple of that. Simple as that. And it's hard. It's hard to stand up, hard to move your legs. I understand why people don't, but sometimes you have to. And that was in relation to this moment. And also a special note on Adele Hanel. Adele is no longer acting. She very publicly retired from the French film industry because she said, like, there's such a culture of abuse. And she has talked about abuse that she has suffered at the hands of other directors. It's also worth noting that she and Sciamma dated. They met on Water Lilies, and they dated for a little bit after that, and they didn't work together by the time Portrait of a Lady on Fire came out. They were no longer working together, but they're on good terms. It is also interesting because Sciamma has said that Portrait of a Lady on Fire, it's also about the artist-muse relationship, but she's like, my point in that movie is there are no muses, it's about collaboration. And people have brought up the age gap between Hanel, who was a legal adult by the time she was dating Sciamma, but I guess the most I could say is, again, Adele has talked at length about being preyed upon in the French film industry, and whenever she's talked about Celine, it has been nothing but, nope, she's a very respectful person, and I have never felt abused by her in any way. But I do think that is a loss for just cinema as a whole, because Hanel is, I think, a fantastic actress, and it is very sad that something like more institutionalized sexism, where abuse is allowed to just go on unchallenged, ends up costing women their careers. I mean, we've also seen that in the United States with cases like Harvey Weinstein. So this is a good line from the Guardian interview, and this is just from the writer itself. The French establishment, she feels, is institutionally sexist, unapologetically hidebound. The industry is run by old white men who are terrified of change. And that's why she had to carve out a space on the margins, celebrating her rebel girls and their secret lives. She said that if her homeland won't listen, maybe the rest of the world will. And with that, if anyone has any questions or wondering where to start with Celine Sciamma, I will take them for you. Oh, a new message. All right. Does anyone have any questions or one who to or like where to start if you'd like you're like what movie should I watch first? Actually, Todd, so you were actually quiet. I talked the whole time. You've watched I've kind of tried to give you a crash course in Celine over the past week or so. Of the three you've seen, which one did you like the best?
I mean, again, I'll admit, likewise, I kind of have that bias point from that screening of Portrait of a Lady on Fire. But even outside of that, that is just a film that, I mean, you kind of said it best. It really just everything in it works.
Yeah. I mean, I think they all work. And again, I really like Tomboy. There was one like to revisit about 10 years later. I almost kind of feel like, oh no, there's a lot of people I don't want to know about this movie because they're going to hate it. And then, I don't think Celine has social media, but it's like, oh no, people are going to be horrible. Actually, I should say the person who played Laura slash Mikhail in Tomboy is still acting. Zoe Herlan, still acting, and guess what? Playing a kid who's kind of figuring their gender out. Guess what? Didn't warp them. They're still acting and they're still like just living their lives. But yeah, Tomboy you can get in G-Milks. Petite Maman is somewhere. I would actually say Petite Maman might be a good starter. It's also very quick. It's about 75 minutes. But again, that's one where have tissues on hand. But I can attest that Derry Public Library does have Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and it is amazing. It is one of the best movies of the century. Um, kind of wish we could have had Ellie here to talk about Petite Maman, but I know that unfortunately she had other stuff going on. But at the same time, I think if she were here, we would still be going about Petite Maman. Um, So with that, I do just want to give a quick rundown of some of the other programs we have coming up. So next month, I am going to be talking about Shelley Duvall. We lost her about a year ago at this point. And I think a lot of people mainly know her from The Shining. I kind of want to talk about her work, the work she did otherwise. She did great work with Robert Altman, and for me, I am a huge fan of her work with fairy tale theater. That was actually my introduction to Shelley Duvall because I was younger. So, um, so next month is Shelley Duvall. I think it's September. I'm going to be covering another actress, Joan Chen. She has a backstory that's extremely interesting, and she was friends with one of my favorite authors, Angie Min. But before that, we have August. And in August, I usually let Todd choose the theme because it's his birthday. So, Todd, would you like to tell us who we're going to be talking about film-wise for the month of August?
So it's gonna be a weird change of pace. I'm not picking a director who goes into the weird, the dark, and the twisted. We're going to be taking a look at one of America's most acclaimed comedic directors, and there's the great Mel Brooks, starting from his early days of even before his films, going to things like the 2,000-Year-Old Man and Get Smart, all the way up to his first movie, The Producers, and then his subsequent musical, The Producers, several decades later.
Yeah, Mel Brooks, an American treasure. Again, the same reason I don't do Hayao Miyazaki. I'm kind of like, all right, I hope this keeps him safe.
I mean, I'll point out, in terms of earlier projects, Werner Herzog is still with us.
He is. Well, here's the thing. I think even death is afraid of Werner Herzog. I think what was that joke you had where it was like death looks at Werner Herzog and Werner Herzog just looks and goes, I thought not, you coward. Um, and I think, Todd, are we doing David Cronenberg for October?
I think we are finally pulling the trigger on that one, yes.
Yes. Well, and then in November, Ellie is definitely going to be here for this program because we've talked about doing this for a while. We are going to be doing Nick Cage November. Uh, we're going to have to figure out how to talk about Nick Cage's filmography that doesn't take 3 hours, but we will figure it out, everybody.
We could probably put a large chunk on a slide that is just called Nick Cage owes money.
Nick Cage's tax evasion problems. Alrighty, but with that, I will bid everyone a good night. And again, go watch Portrait of a Lady on Fire. That movie is beautiful. All right, have a good night.